So you talk about perception. My only two immediate concerns from a perception perspective are what my wife must be going through right now
Yeah.
and the impact this is going to have on the Canadian Forces.
Where do we go? Russ, is there anything you want from me? Is there anything you want me to explain? Is there something missing that you're struggling with that I can shed some light on for you?
I'm struggling with how upset my wife is right now.
Russ, what are you looking for?
I'm concerned that they're tearing apart my wife's brand new house.
So am I. But if nobody tells them what's there and what's not, they don't have any choice. This investigation will end up costing no less than $10 million. Easy. And they will say no to nothing. Any request this major case manager makes on this case, they've already been told it's approved. Don't even bother asking.
I want to minimize the impact on my wife.
So do I.
So how do we do that?
Well, we start by telling the truth.
Okay.
Okay. So where is she?
Get him out.
He sat across the table calmly, his posture straight, his hands folded, his voice controlled. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He answered questions politely. He listened carefully. He appeared cooperative, engaged, and attentive to every word spoken by the investigators in the room. If someone had entered the interrogation at that moment, they might have assumed this was a routine interview, one that would end with a handshake and a quiet exit. But the detectives did not rush. They did not challenge him. They did not argue. They understood that this interview would not be resolved through pressure or confrontation. It would end when the evidence no longer allowed the conversation to continue. Russell Williams was not unknown to investigators, but neither was he immediately suspect in the way most people imagine. He held a position of authority and responsibility. His public image was one of discipline, structure, and control. When police began their investigation, they were not looking for a dramatic collapse or a sudden confession. They were assembling a pattern. They were documenting behavior. They were preparing for a moment that could not be forced, only reached. The interview began with routine questions. Williams responded clearly. His tone was calm. His answers were measured. He did not appear defensive. He did not hesitate. Investigators noted that he seemed comfortable in the room, comfortable with the process, and confident in his ability to explain himself. According to interrogation specialists, this early confidence often signals a belief that the narrative is still intact. At this stage, the subject believes the conversation is manageable. Detectives allowed this confidence to exist. They asked open-ended questions. They gave him space to speak. They observed not only what he said, but how he said it. His pacing, his posture, his eye contact. Every detail was being recorded. The room itself was quiet. There was no background noise, no unnecessary movement. Silence was not avoided. It was allowed to settle between questions, creating space for reflection and response. As the interview progressed, investigators slowly shifted their focus. They did not accuse. They did not raise inconsistencies yet. They began to narrow the scope of their questions, guiding the conversation toward specific timelines and locations. Williams continued to answer. His responses remained polite and composed. However, investigators noted subtle changes. His answers became slightly longer. He began to explain more than necessary. According to experienced interviewers, over-explanation can signal an awareness that precision matters. At this point, the detectives were not seeking confirmation. They were preparing context. They understood that evidence, when introduced too early, can harden a subject's position. Evidence introduced at the right moment, however, can remove all remaining options. This interview was designed for that moment. The detectives asked Williams to clarify his movements, his routines, his access to certain locations. He complied. He offered explanations. He appeared confident that his answers would hold. The tone of the interview remained calm, almost conversational. There was no visible tension in the room, but tension does not always announce itself. Often it appears first as carefulness. Investigators continued listening. They allowed Williams to commit to his version of events. Each answer was noted. Each detail was placed within a broader framework already established by the investigation. Unknown to him, the detectives were no longer testing the story. They were preparing to end it. When the evidence was introduced, it was done without ceremony. There was no dramatic reveal, no raised voices. The detectives placed photographs on the table. They did not explain them immediately. They allowed Williams to look. The room became quieter. His posture changed slightly. His eyes moved across the images. According to investigators, this was the moment the interview shifted irreversibly. Evidence, unlike words, does not ask for interpretation. It does not negotiate. It simply exists. The photographs did not accuse him. They did not argue. They removed the space his explanations had occupied. Investigators watched carefully. Williams did not respond immediately. Silence filled the room. This silence was not accidental. It was intentional. When he began to speak again, his voice was different. Still controlled, but slower. His answers became shorter. Where earlier he had explained freely, he now paused. According to interrogation experts, this change often marks the realization that the narrative can no longer be maintained through explanation alone. The subject is no longer speaking to convince. He is speaking to survive the moment. Detectives did not interrupt. They did not press. They allowed the evidence to remain visible on the table. Each photograph represented a point that could not be argued away. As the minutes passed, Williams' responses became less certain. His confidence did not collapse suddenly. It diminished incrementally. Each answer carried less weight than the one before it. This interview did not end with a dramatic confession. It ended with inevitability. The evidence had reached a point where no further explanation could restore coherence. Investigators continued to observe. They documented the change in demeanor, the shift in language, the narrowing of responses. According to police records, this moment is often described as the end of the interview, even if words continue to be exchanged. Williams eventually acknowledged what the evidence established. The details of the case would later be addressed through legal proceedings. The outcome would be determined in court, but the interrogation itself has continued to be studied for a different reason. It demonstrates how an interview can conclude without confrontation, without coercion, and without spectacle. This case is frequently referenced in professional training, not because of what was said, but because of what was shown. The detectives did not overpower the subject. They did not out-argue him. They waited. They allowed documentation to replace discussion. When that transition occurred, the interview no longer required questions. In many interrogations, the collapse of a story is loud. Voices rise, emotions surface. This was not one of those cases. This was quiet, controlled, methodical. The evidence spoke first, and once it did, there was nothing left to negotiate. Investigators later noted that the success of the interview lay in restraint. The restraint to wait, the restraint to listen, the restraint to allow silence to do its work. According to those who study interrogation techniques, this approach often produces the most reliable outcomes, not because it forces admission, but because it removes alternatives. In the end, the interview did not fail because the subject made a single mistake. It ended because every remaining explanation depended on conditions that no longer existed. The evidence did not change. The room did not change. Only the story did. This is why the interrogation is still studied. It shows that evidence does not need to be aggressive to be decisive. It does not need to be dramatic to be final. When introduced with patience and precision, it closes conversations on its own. In investigations, people often focus on confessions. But confessions are not the measure of truth. Documentation is. Recorded facts do not respond to persuasion. They do not adjust themselves to fit explanations. They remain fixed, waiting to be acknowledged. This interview ended not with words but with silence. And in that silence, the evidence no longer needed interpretation. It had already said everything.